Cold has a taste, and it tastes like a copper penny pressed flat under a boot heel and the green rot of a wound going wrong. It does not feel the way the songs promise. It feels like a fistful of nettles packed under the fingernails, like swallowing crushed ice that never melts, like your own blood slowing to sap inside you. There was the smell of splintered pine and lamp oil, and the iron stink of a horse that had stopped breathing. 300 feet of mountain below, one wagon broken open like a dropped egg, and 1,000 miles of December that did not care whether she lived. She was clawing up the slope on 2 ruined hands, dragging a body that would not obey, fully ready to die there and spit at the snow while she did it. Then a shadow fell across the white, and it did not move the way wind moves. A voice came out of it, low and scraped raw, smelling of wet bear hide and pine pitch. "Don't fight me." She fought him anyway. That was the first thing Eli Vance learned about the woman he carried up off the Bitterroot Pass, and it was the last thing about her that ever surprised him. But to understand how she came to be there, broken-handed and half-frozen, and clutching a brass thimble so hard it had cut a crescent into her palm. You have to go back 4 days. To the morning the Dunmore freight line told a column of settlers that the upper pass was still open. It was a lie. Cyrus Dunmore knew it was a lie when he sold the tickets, and the men who worked his road knew it too. Maren Adler had counted her money 3 times that morning by the light of a tin lantern, the way she counted everything, because numbers were the one thing in the world that had never betrayed her. $18.40, a bolt of unsold wool, a box of pins, a paper of needles, 3 spools of thread, and the brass thimble her mother had worn until the day the fever took her. That was the whole of what Maren Adler owned at 21 years old, and it was meant to buy her a new life in a valley town 200 miles west, where a dressmaker with steady hands could earn her keep without owing anything to anyone. Her father had owed plenty. That was the trouble that put her on the wagon in the first place. Tom Adler had been dead 9 months, and the debt he left behind had teeth. He had borrowed against the next season's freight from Cyrus Dunmore's concern, $215 at a usurer's interest, and the next season had never come, and when a man dies owing the wrong outfit, the outfit comes to collect from whoever is left standing. Maren had handed over the house. She had handed over the team, but 2. She had handed over her father's tools and her own sewing machine, the treadle one with the iron stand he'd bought her the year she turned 16, and still the ledger in the freight office showed $40 unpaid, and $40 to Cyrus Dunmore was not money, it was leverage. She had stood at that counter on a gray October morning, the smell of axle grease and cheap tobacco thick in the close little office, and she had watched Dunmore's clerk run a yellowed thumbnail down the column of figures. 40 even, the clerk said. He was a narrow man with ink on his fingers and a way of not quite looking at her face. "Mr. Dunmore's a reasonable man, miss. There's other coin a young woman carries that he'd reckon against the balance, if she had a mind to be sensible about it." The smell of the place had turned in her stomach. She knew exactly what he meant. Every cornered woman in the territory knew exactly what he meant. Maren pressed her thumb hard against the brass thimble on her finger, the way she did before she said the things that cost her, and she felt the cool brass and her mother in it. "Write this in your ledger," she said, and her voice did not shake, which surprised them both. "Maren Adler would sooner die in a ditch on the open road than pay 1 cent of my father's debt with the only thing your Mr. Dunmore couldn't already take. You tell him that, word for word." The clerk's pen had stopped. He'd looked at her then, finally, and there had been something in his flat clerk's eyes she did not have a name for at the time, and would have a name for soon enough. "He'll have his 40, miss," he said quietly. "One way or the other. Mr. Dunmore always collects." So she took the open road instead, with the $18 and the wool and the thimble, on a settler's wagon bound up and over the pass before the snow closed it. She thought she was running toward a clean life. She did not understand, not yet, that Cyrus Dunmore had heard her answer word for word, and that men like Dunmore do not let an answer like that stand, that the freight man had already decided the road would close behind her, and that he had men on his payroll who knew which end of a saw to use on a break. The morning they rolled out, the sky was the flat white of a fresh scrubbed plate, and the air bit at the inside of her nose with every breath. There were 4 wagons in the column and 19 souls, and a guide named Royce who rode at the head with a plug of tobacco in his cheek and a habit of not meeting anyone's eye. He worked for the Dunmore line. Maren had thought nothing of it at the time. A freight outfit that ran the road would naturally guide the road, and she had been too glad of the open route to wonder why the man who guided it kept glancing back down the column and counting heads like a man taking inventory. Maren rode in the 3rd wagon beside an old homesteader named Pell and his wife, Hetty, and she kept her hands busy the whole first day, hemming a torn shirt for a coin, because idle hands let a person think, and thinking was a thing she could not afford. Hetty Pell was a soft, round woman who had buried 2 children on the trail east years before and had a way of patting Maren's knee that asked nothing in return. "You travel light, child," Hetty said on the second morning, eyeing the single carpet bag and the bolt of wool. "I travel free," Maren said, and pressed her thumb against the thimble, and Hetty had laughed and let it go. By the second day, the trail tilted up hard against the shoulder of the mountain, and the pines closed in black on either side, and the snow began. Not the gentle kind, but the kind that comes sideways and stings. The cold got into the wagon boards and into the joints of every soul aboard. Old Pell muttered that the season was turning faster than the calendar promised, and that a road agent worth his pay would have turned them back at the last way station, and Royce, when he heard it, only spat tobacco into the snow and said the pass held another 2 days easy. It did not hold 2 days. By the 3rd night, the column had stopped trusting Royce. He kept them moving when a sane man would have turned back. He whipped the lead team up grades slick as soap, and twice he rode ahead alone and came back saying the way was clear when the men who walked it could see for themselves it was not. "He's running us at this like he's got somewhere to be," Pell said low to his wife, not low enough, and Royce's shoulders had stiffened up at the head of the column, and Maren had marked it and filed it away the way she filed every figure that did not add up. And on the 4th morning, on the narrowest shelf of the whole pass, with a drop on the left side that fell away into nothing, Royce reined his horse off to the high side of the trail and let the column roll past him. And Maren Adler heard a sound she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. It was the crack of a brake shoe letting go all at once, not wearing through but breaking clean, the way a thing breaks when it has been cut most of the way through and left to finish itself. The lead wagon went first, then the slope took the second. Maren remembered the world turning sideways, remembered Pell's wife screaming a name, remembered the brass thimble on her finger as she grabbed for anything and found only air. The wagon hit the rocks below and came apart, and the cold came up to meet her like a second floor she had not known was there. When she woke, it was full dark, and she was the only thing moving on the whole mountain. She would not learn for a long time that Royce had survived too, because Royce had jumped before the shelf gave way. She would not learn until later still that the brake shoe on the lead wagon had been sawn 3/4 through by a man paid in Dunmore silver, because a wreck on the high pass erased a debt cleaner than any court, and a dead column told no tales about a road that was never safe to sell. All Maren knew that first night was that her hands would not close, that something in her side ground when she breathed, and that 19 people had gone down the mountain and she was the one the snow had spat back out. She found Hetty Pell first, 20 feet from the broken wagon, and there was nothing to be done for her, and Maren took off her own glove with her teeth and closed the old woman's eyes with 2 fingers gone clumsy from the cold. She found Pell a little farther on. She called out names into the dark until her voice gave out, and nothing answered but the wind walking through the wreckage and the creak of a wheel still slowly turning where the second wagon had come to rest against a rock. 19 souls had rolled out of the way station 4 mornings ago, and the mountain had kept 18 of them, and the arithmetic of that was a sum Maren Adler would carry for the rest of her life. She started climbing because the alternative was lying down, and Maren Adler had told a clerk in a freight office that she would die in a ditch before she gave up, and she'd be damned if she'd make a liar of herself now. She climbed because somebody had to live to say what had happened on that shelf. She did not know yet that this was exactly the reason a man down in the valley needed her dead. That is where Eli Vance found her. Not down at the wreck, where a careful man would have looked. Halfway up an impossible slope in the black cold, dragging herself toward a ridgeline she could not see, leaving a smear of dark behind her on the snow. He was 38 years old, and he had not spoken more than 10 words to another living soul in 14 months. He had been a different man once, in a different country, before a creek in Tennessee called Shiloh taught him what men do to one another and what the cost of it is. He had come west to be alone, and he had gotten very good at it. And the worst part of being good at it, the part nobody warned him about, was this. The worst part of dying alone in the mountains is knowing that when you finally scream, the only thing that hears you is the trees. He had heard her before he saw her, a sound like an animal that would not quit. Eli Vance came down the slope the way he did everything, without hurry and without wasted motion, the cold mechanical focus of a man who has decided what needs doing and has stopped asking himself how he feels about it. He crouched in the snow in front of her. He did not tip his hat because he wore none. He did not offer his name. He looked at her hands and at the angle of her side and at the crescent of blood where the thimble had cut her, and he made a sound low in his throat that was not quite a word. "Don't fight me," he said, and Maren Adler, who weighed barely 100 pounds, soaking wet, and could not close either fist, drew back her arm and tried to hit him. He let her. He took the blow on his shoulder like he took the wind, and he waited until her arm fell back into the snow because she had nothing left, and then he wrapped her in the heavy bearskin off his own back and lifted her against his chest as though she weighed no more than the wool bolt she'd lost on the mountain. She smelled the bear hide and the pine pitch and the wood smoke ground into the man, and she hated that some animal part of her, some part below thought, leaned toward the heat of him. "You're not freight," she rasped, because it was the meanest thing she could think to say, and she did not yet know why she said it. He stopped for half a step. Then he kept walking up the mountain, into the dark, and he said, "No, you're not." The climb to his cabin took most of what was left of the night. He carried her 4,000 feet up a trail that was not a trail, through timber so thick the snow barely reached the ground, and he did not set her down once. She drifted in and out. Each time she surfaced, she found the same things: the slow rock of his stride, the heat of his chest against her cheek, the smell of bear hide and pine, and the brass thimble still gripped in her fist where the cold had welded her fingers half shut around it. Once she came up enough to feel him breathing hard on a steep pitch, and she said thickly that he should put her down, that she wasn't worth carrying, that the cold would take her anyway, and he might as well save his strength. "Hush," was all he said. Not unkind, just a man with no breath to spare for argument. Once she felt the warm wet of her own blood working through the bandage he'd wrapped over her ribs, and she thought, with the strange flat calm of the freezing, that she would die owing this stranger the cost of his bearskin, and that the arithmetic of it offended her even now. When the trees finally broke, he stood at the lip of a high bench backed against a sheer black cliff, and there, with a single wall of stone at its spine and the whole white roof of the world below it, sat a one-room log cabin with a thread of smoke still rising from a banked fire. A lean-to leaned off its north side. A meat pole stood black against the snow. There was no other light anywhere in all that vast white dark, not down in the dead valley, not back along the murdered pass. Just the one banked ember of a hermit's fire, 4,000 feet up, where the man who owned no land worth taking had built himself the loneliest roof in the territory. The door was the only thing between the cold and the warm. She would learn, over the months to come, that the cabin door was the most important object on the mountain. That on one side of it was a world that priced a woman in gold dust, and on the other side was a world that did not. But that first night she knew only that he shouldered it open, and that the heat hit her like a wall, and that she began, helplessly, to shake. He laid her down on the rope-strung bunk by the stove. He pulled off her ruined boots. He did not touch anything else. When her eyes could focus, she watched him build the fire up, watched him set a pot of snow to melt, watched him crush something dry and green into a tin cup. And the whole time, one hand stayed knotted in the bearskin he'd wrapped her in, because Maren Adler did not trust a kindness she had not paid for, and she was already counting, already pricing, already bracing for the bill. "What's the toll?" she said. Not a question. She'd asked it her whole life. Eli Vance set the tin cup down on the edge of the bunk where she could reach it. Willow bark and something else, steam curling off the top. He crouched so his eyes were level with hers, and for the first time she saw them clear. Pale gray, flat as river ice, and under the flatness something old and tired and careful. "There's no toll," he said. "Everything has a toll." "Not here." He stood. He took a roll of furs from the corner and an oilcloth, and he opened the cabin door to the screaming cold, and he said the words that she would turn over in her mind for the rest of the winter, the words that were the first proof he was not the monster she'd been bought into expecting her whole life. "I sleep out in the lean-to. The bar's on the inside of the door. You set it behind me." He paused on the threshold, snow already gathering on his shoulders. "I won't touch you. Not now, not come spring, not ever, unless the day comes you tell me to. You hear?" She heard. She did not believe him. But she dragged herself up and dropped the heavy bar into its iron brackets behind him, and she lay back down in the warmth he'd left her, and for the first time in 4 days, Maren Adler slept. She did not sleep easy. The fever came up out of her side on the 3rd day. He had cleaned the wound when she'd let him, a deep tear over the ribs where something in the wreck had opened her up, packed with grime and pine needles and 4 days of cold. He'd flushed it with melted snow and pine tar soap, his big hands strangely careful, narrating each thing he did in his flat, low voice so she would not startle. Going to clean this now, going to hurt. It had hurt, but the cold had gotten into it first, and on the 3rd morning her skin went hot and wet, and her words started running together, and Eli Vance, who had buried men who died of less, set his jaw and went to work. He built a steam tent over the bunk with the oilcloth and a frame of green branches, and he threw eucalyptus leaves and a fistful of dried yarrow onto stones heated in the fire, and he tucked the steam in close around her so the heat could draw the poison up. The cabin filled with the sharp green reek of it. He brewed willow bark tea, bitter enough to make her gag, and he made her drink it anyway, holding the cup to her cracked lips, one hand behind her head, counting the swallows out loud so she'd have a number to hold to. The fever took her down into a country with no clean edges. She was on the wagon again, and the world was turning sideways, and Hetty Pell was screaming a name into the snow. She was at the freight counter, and the clerk's pen was scratching her mother's thimble into a ledger as the price of $40. She thrashed, and she fought the blankets, and twice she came up swinging at the dark, certain she'd been bought and brought somewhere to be used, and each time a flat, low voice she did not yet trust said the same thing close to her ear. "You're safe. Nobody owns you. Lie still." And each time, some animal part of her that was below thought heard it and believed it before her mind could catch up and call it a lie. The worst night, her temperature climbed so high he stripped the furs back to cool her, and then, when she shook too hard, banked them close again. And through all of it, he kept the modest blanket tucked to her throat and never once let his care turn into anything she had not given him leave for. He was, even in the dead middle of the night, with no one on the whole mountain to see, exactly the man he had promised to be at the door. And when the wound needed to be opened and drained, he sat her up against his chest because there was nowhere else to brace her, and he threaded a needle with waxed saddle thread by firelight, and he said very quietly into her hair, "I'm sorry. There's no easy way. Hold on to something." She held on to the brass thimble. She had not let it go since the mountain. She bit down on a fold of blanket, and she held the thimble and she felt him work, steady and sure and apologizing under his breath for every stitch, and she understood somewhere in the haze that this was a man who had sewn men up before, on a field by a creek in Tennessee, and that some of them had not lived, and that he was sewing her up the way you do a thing you cannot afford to lose. The thimble was still on the table by the bunk when the fever broke 2 nights later, sitting in a ring of lamplight beside the tin cup, and the first thing Maren Adler did when she could see straight was reach out and close her cut palm around it to be sure it was real. "Why?" she said. Her voice was a ruin. "Why didn't you just leave me down there?" Eli Vance was rendering tallow at the stove, his back to her, and he did not turn around. "Because you were still climbing," he said. And that was all the answer she got, and somehow it was enough. The snow came in earnest the week after, and it did not stop, and the mountain sealed itself shut around the two of them like a fist closing. The pass was gone. The valley was gone. There was the cabin and the lean-to and the cliff at their back and the white roaring nothing beyond, and there was no road down before April, and they both knew it. On the fourth morning of being walled in, Maren got up off the bunk on her own for the first time, gritted her teeth against the pull in her side, and started trying to earn her keep. She was a dressmaker. Her hands knew thread and cloth and the cool geometry of a pattern. They did not know how to do a single thing that mattered 4,000 feet up a frozen mountain. She tried to cook and scorch the cornmeal. She tried to carry water and drop the bucket. She tried, on the 6th day, to drag a frozen hindquarter of venison off the meat pole, and her legs went out from under her, and she sat down hard in the snow and cursed in words a seamstress was not supposed to know. Eli came around the corner of the woodpile and looked at her sitting in the snow with the meat across her lap. "Stop," he said. "I have to be worth something." She would not look at him. "I won't be a thing you feed. I won't be cargo. I've been cargo my whole life, and I would rather freeze." He set down his armload of split wood. He crouched in front of her the way he had on the mountain, and there was something working behind the flat gray eyes that she could not name. "Stop trying to pay me back," he said. "Every meal, you do the sums. I watch you do it. You eat, and you sit there figuring what you owe." His jaw tightened. "It makes me sick, not you. The owing. The fact that somebody taught you that staying alive runs up a bill." He stood and held out one scarred hand to pull her up. "You want to be worth something on this mountain. Fine. Then learn the mountain. Not for me, for you. So that the next time the world drops you off a cliff, you climb out on your own 2 feet, and you don't owe the man at the top a goddamn thing." She looked at his hand for a long, cold beat. Then she took it. That was the morning the winter changed shape. He started teaching her, and she, God help her, she who had sworn off owing, started learning. He taught her to split wood first, because wood was the difference between the quick and the dead at 4,000 feet, and a winter ate cordwood the way the sea eats a shoreline. He showed her how the maul wants to fall on its own weight, and a body just guides it, how you read the grain of a round and let the wood show you where it wants to part. On the 8th day, she buried the blade clean through a round of pine, and stood there breathing hard with her ledger-keeper's hands stinging inside their borrowed gloves, and she looked up to find him watching from the woodpile, and neither of them smiled, but something passed between them that was warmer than a smile. "Again," was all he said, but he said it the way another man might have said "well done." On the 11th morning, he took her out to the trapline and taught her to set a snare in a rabbit run, to find the little beaten roads the hares kept under the snow, and to read the difference between a fox track and a marten track in the fresh fall. She was a quick study, a woman who could lay out a sleeve pattern from a glance at a body could learn to read sign, and by the 2nd week, she was running the near half of the line herself while he worked the far. The skinning was harder. He taught her to skin out a hair without tearing the hide, and to scrape the membrane clean, and to work the rendered brains into the skin until it went soft and supple, and her stomach turned the first 3 times, and on the 4th, it did not. She learned to render tallow in the heavy iron pot until the cabin smelled of hot fat and the candles she could pour from it. She learned to bank a fire so it held the night through, to read the sky off the cliff for the next storm, to walk in the bear-paw snowshoes he wove her from green ash and rawhide without pitching face first into a drift. Her dressmaker's hands, that had known only the cool geometry of thread and cloth, learned the heft of a skinning knife and the bite of a frozen trap spring. By the middle of the 2nd week, her palms had cracked and bled and started to callous over, and she caught herself one night turning her hands toward the firelight, studying the new hardness in them the way she used to study a hem, and finding, to her surprise, that she was not sorry. They were not a lady's hands anymore. They were not a thing to be priced across a freight counter. They were becoming, knuckle by callus by scar, her own. On the 14th night, the storm that had been building all day came down off the cliff and tried to take the roof. The wind got under the eaves on the north side and stripped shakes off into the dark, and the cold poured in through the gap like water through a stove in Hull. Eli was up the cliffside ladder in the screaming black before she'd finished pulling on her boots, and Maren, who 3 weeks before could not carry a bucket, climbed up after him with a coil of rawhide and a fist of square nails clenched in her teeth, and the two of them lashed and nailed an oilcloth and a green hide over the gap by feel, the wind trying to peel them off the roof the whole time. When they got back down inside, shaking and white to the elbows with snow, Eli looked at her standing there with the rawhide still around her neck and the last nail still in her fist. "You should have stayed by the fire," he said, but a question rode under the words, and they both heard it plain. "It's my roof, too," Maren said. "I'm not going to sit warm under a hole and let you fall off it alone." And she pressed her thumb to the brass thimble without thinking, and Eli looked at her for a long beat, and then he turned and built the fire up so neither of them would have to say what had just been said. The days after that ran together. Weeks bled into one another, measured by the shrinking stack of firewood and the lengthening line of stretched hides on the cabin wall. A mule shared the mountain with them too, the one living thing besides herself that had come off the pass. Eli had found it 3 days after the wreck, standing stupid and shivering in a draw below the trail, its leg cut but sound. He'd brought it up because a mule was worth the trouble, and Maren had named it Juniper over his flat objection that you do not name what you might one day have to eat, and she had taken its keeping as her own. She braided burrs out of its mane. She wintered it in the lee of the lean-to. And when, in the lean month of February, Eli had looked at the shrinking grain and looked at the mule and said the practical thing in his practical voice, Maren had stepped between him and the animal with a skinning knife held low and steady and said, "You touch Juniper, and we are done, you and me, whatever this is." And Eli Vance, hyper-competent killer of everything that walked the mountain, looked at the set of her jaw, weighed it, and then turned around and went back to his traps, and the mule lived. It was the first time she understood that the man who owed her nothing would still bend the whole shape of his life around the things she loved. February was the lean month, the month the mountain tries to starve you out before the thaw can save you. The meat pole went down to bones. The grain sack went flat. They ate smaller and smaller, and Eli ate smallest of all, and Maren caught him at it on the 19th day of the lean, pushing the better half of the rabbit across the plate toward her and calling it leavings. "Don't," she said. "Don't you do that. I've watched a man do that before. My father went hungry quiet so I wouldn't see, and then he died owing, and I will not sit across a fire from another man who starves himself polite for me." Eli looked at the plate between them. The flat gray eyes worked at something. "You're still mending. You need it more. We need it the same." She took her skinning knife and divided the rabbit dead even down the middle, the way she'd once divided a length of cloth, exact to the thread. "Even, Eli Vance. Up here, it's even, or it's nothing. That's my toll. You want me to stop counting what I owe you, then you stop keeping a ledger where you pay for me with your own hunger." She slid his half back at him. "Eat." And Eli Vance, who had not taken an order from a living soul in 14 years, looked at the even-split rabbit, and then at her, and he ate. It was, though neither of them said so, the night the last of the transaction died between them, the night they stopped being a man and the woman he'd paid for, and became, simply, two people splitting what there was, even, against the cold. She'd like to tell you the winter was all hardness and frost. It wasn't. There were the long blue evenings when the work was done, and the fire was banked, and the wind walked the roof, and they would sit on opposite sides of the stove, him mending a trap, her stitching by the lamp. She'd patched every garment in the cabin twice over and started in on a new shirt cut from the unsold wool she'd carried up the mountain, sized, though she'd not said so, For a man with shoulders like a barn door. She would catch him watching her hands move the needle, and he would look away, and neither of them would say a thing, and the not saying got warmer week by week until it was its own kind of fire. It was on one of those evenings, with the lamp turned low and the stove ticking, that she finally asked him the thing she'd wanted to ask since the mountain. "What happened to you?" Maren said. "Before this, a man doesn't get this good at being alone for no reason." For a while he didn't answer. He set down the trap. He looked at the dark window, where the snow ticked against the glass, and when he spoke his voice was lower than she'd ever heard it. "You've come a long way into this story with me," he said, not quite to her, almost to the glass, almost to the listener at the door of the night. "If you've stayed with me this far, stay a while longer, because what I'm about to tell you is the part I've never told anyone, and the part that comes after it is worse." He turned the trap over once in his big hands and set it down for good. "I came up out of a war. I was at a creek called Shiloh in the spring of '62. I won't paint it for you. I'll only say that I learned there exactly what a man is capable of, mine included, and when it was over, I couldn't be near people who didn't know. So I came up here. I figured if I was going to be a thing that does terrible things, I'd be it where I couldn't do them to anybody who mattered." He looked at her, then, full on. "And then, a woman fell off the pass who wouldn't stop climbing, and I'm not sure I'm that thing anymore. That's all. That's the toll, if you want one. Knowing me costs you knowing that." Maren pressed her thumb against the brass thimble on her finger. Then she got up and crossed the cabin and sat down on the floor beside his chair, close enough that her shoulder leaned against his knee, and she did not say anything at all, because some things a person says with the leaning and not the words. That was the midpoint of the winter and the midpoint of the thing between them, and it was the night Maren Adler understood that she had stopped sleeping with one hand on the thimble out of fear and started keeping it close for an entirely different reason. If she had known what was already grinding its way up the pass toward them, she'd have slept with the rifle instead. Because down in the valley, Cyrus Dunmore had a problem, and the problem had a name, and the name was Maren Adler. He had thought the pass would take care of it. 19 souls down the mountain in a wreck the law would call an accident, and the Adler debt erased, and the cargo, 2 crates of mining bonds he'd insured for triple their worth, gone clean off the books. A profitable winter. Except that in March, when Royce came slinking back into the valley with his jumped clear story, he let slip over whiskey that he'd seen a 4th wagon's worth of tracks leading up off the pass, not down. A drag mark. A body that had climbed when it should have died. And Cyrus Dunmore, who insured wagons against everything but his own conscience, did the arithmetic faster than Maren ever could, and did not like the sum. A survivor was a witness. A witness who'd ridden in the 3rd wagon, who'd watched a sawn brake shoe let go on a clear shelf, who had a dead father's grudge and a clerk's memory for numbers, was the one thing that could put a rope around Cyrus Dunmore's neck. So he did what his kind always do. He hid behind the paper. He went to the territorial marshal, a soft, purchasable man named Hollis Pratt, and he swore out a document, a claim that the Adler debt survived the daughter, that the girl had fled lawful collection, that she was harboring stolen freight up the mountain. He turned a murder he'd ordered into a lawful errand. And on the last hard week of March, with the snow rotting toward thaw, Cyrus Dunmore rode up the pass with Marshal Hollis Pratt and 4 hired men to silence the only survivor before the road opened and she could carry her story down. Maren saw them first. She'd gone out at first light to check the snares, and from the high snow above the trapline, she looked down the long white throat of the pass and saw 6 riders strung out single file where no honest traveler had any business being a week before the thaw. She knew the shape of the lead horse before she could see the face. She'd watched that gelding stand outside her father's house the day they took it. She came down off the mountain faster than she'd ever moved in her life and slammed through the cabin door and said one word. Dunmore. Eli Vance did not waste a breath asking how she knew. He went to the wall and took down the Winchester and a box of brass cartridges, and he started working the lever with the same flat economy he did everything, checking the action, and over his shoulder he said, "How many?" "6. One's a marshal. He has paper, Eli. He's made it legal." Her voice cracked on it. "They wrecked the wagon. They cut the brake. They killed 19 people to bury my father's debt, and they're going to do it legal." He looked at her for 1 second, and something moved in the flat gray eyes that she'd only seen once before, on the mountain, the night he came down the slope. "Then we don't let them make it legal," he said. What came next, Maren would not be able to tell straight for years. She remembered the cold coming through the gun port he'd cut beside the door, a thing she'd thought was for ventilation, and now understood a hermit had built for exactly this. She remembered him pressing the loaded Winchester into her hands and folding her fingers around it and saying, low and flat and certain, "If one of them comes through that door, and it isn't me, you put him down. You've earned the right. Don't you dare die owing anybody an apology for it." Then he'd taken his own long rifle and a skinning knife and gone out the side window into the timber, and the door had barred behind him with her on the inside of it and the whole murdering world on the other. She remembered Dunmore's voice carrying up the bench, oily and sure of itself, reading the marshal's paper into the wind. He had a fine carrying voice, the voice of a man used to reading prices to a crowd. He told her she was harboring stolen freight. He told her the Adler debt had passed to her lawfully, and she had fled lawful collection. He told her that if she came down peaceable, Marshal Pratt would see her treated according to the law of the territory, and the way he said the law made it sound like a thing you could buy by the yard, because to Cyrus Dunmore it was. "I know you can hear me, Miss Adler," he called. "You always were a girl for sums. So do the arithmetic. 6 of us, 1 of him, and the law's own paper in my hand. There's only one way this column reaches the bottom of the pass." A pause, oily and patient. "Come down and be sensible about it." She remembered Eli's answer, which was not words. The first hired man who came up over the lip of the bench with a rifle leveled did not get to fire it. Eli Vance had moved out the side of the cabin and through the timber before the man cleared the snow, and he closed the distance the way a falling tree closes the distance to the ground, and the man went down into the white and did not get up to shoot again. The second one ran. That was the thing about the hired ones. They'd been paid for an errand, not a war, and the moment the errand turned into the cold mechanical death coming at them through the pines, 2 of the 4 simply turned their horses and were gone down the pass and out of the story. But Cyrus Dunmore had not come up the mountain to lose, and Marshal Hollis Pratt had been paid too well to fold, and one of them put a rifle ball through the meat of Eli's shoulder as he came back across the open ground toward the cabin. Maren saw him go down. She saw the snow turn dark under his shoulder and saw him try to rise on the bad arm and fall back, saw the marshal and Dunmore and the last hired man start across the bench toward him with the unhurried walk of men who have decided the fight is won. And something happened inside Maren Adler that had been 10 years coming. The fear that had ridden her since the freight office, the bracing for the bill, the counting and the pricing and the certainty that she was cargo to be claimed. It all went cold and clear and quiet, the way the air goes still before the real snow comes. She picked up the Winchester off the floor where it had skidded from his hand. She'd watched him work the lever 100 times that winter, mending it by the fire, and her seamstress hands, that knew the exact tension of a thread, knew this too now. She braced the barrel against the doorframe, the way he'd shown her without ever saying he was showing her. She put the bead front sight on the last hired man, and she breathed out the way he breathed out before he split a round of pine. And she fired. The hired man sat down in the snow and decided, abruptly, that the errand was over. That left Dunmore and the marshal raised his rifle toward the doorway, toward her, and Maren Adler worked the lever, and her hands were not shaking anymore. "You put that paper down," she called out across the bench, and her voice did not crack this time. "Or I will put you down where the snow can have you, and come the thaw I'll carry the truth of that brake shoe down to every honest man in the territory, and there is no document on God's earth that buries 19 people twice." And then Eli Vance came up out of the timber on Dunmore's blind side. He'd circled the whole bench through the trees while the freight man read his paper to a doorway. And now he came across the open snow towards Cyrus Dunmore, without hurry and without a sound. The long rifle held low, the cold mechanical focus of a predator that has stopped asking itself anything at all. Dunmore heard the snow crunch and turned and saw death walking at him out of the white, bleeding from one shoulder and not slowing for it, and the fine carrying auctioneer's voice that had read prices over a crowd, his whole life climbed up half an octave into something thin. "Pratt," Dunmore said. "Pratt, shoot him. That's an order. I'm paying you to." But the marshal had seen what was coming across the snow too, and a soft, purchasable man does the arithmetic of his own skin faster than any other arithmetic on earth, and Hollis Pratt was already backing his horse away, with his rifle pointed at nothing. It was Cyrus Dunmore who broke first. It always is. The marshal might have called the bluff a minute before, but Dunmore had ordered the wreck. Dunmore had paid for the saw, and Dunmore had spent the whole winter believing the mountain had cleaned up after him. And to see the one survivor standing in a doorway with a steady rifle, and the mountain man closing the distance with that flat, killing patience, was to see the rope he'd dodged swing back toward his neck. He dropped the document in the snow. He put his soft hands up. He started talking. Terms, money, a way for everyone to walk away whole. He hid behind words one more time, the way he'd hidden his whole life, offering her gold to forget what she'd seen. She let him talk himself empty. Then she said, "There's no toll high enough, Mr. Dunmore. I'm not for sale. I never was. That was always the part you couldn't understand." By the time it was over, the marshal had decided his fee did not cover dying, and had turned his soft, purchasable self around and ridden down the pass to invent a story that left him out of it. Dunmore went down behind him, alive, because Maren would not have it any other way. "He hangs in a court, in front of everyone, with the truth read out loud," she said. "Or it isn't justice, it's just the mountain again." And she was right. And Eli, bleeding into the snow with her hand pressed hard against the wound, looked up at her with something on his face that no one had earned from him since before a creek in Tennessee. And he said, "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" And she said, "From a man who taught me the mountain and pretended he wasn't." And for the first time in 14 years, Eli Vance laughed. She dug the ball out of his shoulder that night by firelight with the waxed saddle thread and the steady hands he'd given her, and she narrated each thing she did in a flat, low voice so he would not startle, the way he'd done for her. And when it was done and bound, she sat back on her heels and looked at the brass thimble glinting on the table in the lamplight, and understood that the winter had turned them inside out, each into the other's keeper. The thaw came 3 weeks later, the way it always does, all at once and impossible to believe. The icicles wept off the eaves. The pass groaned and shifted and let go of its dead. The first green came up at the edge of the snow in a line, and the road down to the valley opened like a door that had been shut for half a year. And on the morning the road opened, Eli Vance did the hardest thing he had ever done. He went to the corner of the cabin, and he dug a heavy leather pouch out from under a loose floorboard. The gold dust off a winter of pelts, 2 ounces of it, $65 and more, the whole of his worth in this world. And he set it down on the table beside the brass thimble, and he pushed it across to her. "The road's open," he said. His voice was flat, but she'd learned to hear under the flat. "This is yours. It's enough to get you to San Francisco, or up to Oregon, or anywhere the Dunmores of the world don't know your name. Enough to start over owing nobody. A dressmaker with steady hands." He could not look at her. "You testify against him from down there, where it's safe, and you build the life you got on that wagon to build. You don't owe me a thing. You never did. That was the whole point." Maren Adler looked at the leather pouch of gold dust sitting on the table beside her mother's thimble. The two things side by side, the price of freedom, and the only thing she'd carried up the mountain. She looked a long time. Then she picked up the pouch, and she walked across the cabin, and she knelt down, and she pried up the loose floorboard he'd taken it from. and she set the gold back down in the dark under the floor where it had wintered, and she pressed the board back into place over it with the heel of her hand, and she stood up and dusted off her knees. "What are you doing?" Eli said, very low. "Burying it." She turned around. Her thumb was pressed hard against the brass thimble, the way it always was before she said the things that cost her, except this did not cost her anything at all. This was the first thing in her whole life that came free. "It stays under the floor, Eli Vance, where I can get to it if I'm ever fool enough to want a life that's smaller than this one. I'll go down and I'll testify, and I'll watch Cyrus Dunmore hang in front of the whole territory with the truth of that brake shoe read out loud. And then, I'm coming back up the pass, because down there is a world that priced me in gold dust my whole life, and up here is the one place that never did, and I am not such a fool that I'd trade the second for the first." She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that he had to look at her. "You said you'd never touch me unless the day came I told you to." He went very still. "This is me telling you," Maren said, and Eli Vance, who had not let himself want a single thing for 14 years, reached up with his good hand and cupped the side of her face like a man cupping water he was sure would run through his fingers, and he found that for once it did not. There was no wedding that spring. There was no preacher up the pass, no white veil, no town to stand witness, and neither of them wanted one. The asking and answering of it had happened already, slow, across a whole winter. In 100 things, neither of them had said out loud. What there was this: a cabin against a cliff with the snow gone off the bench, and a mule named Juniper grazing the first green grass, and a woman who'd come off the mountain with $18 and a thimble teaching herself the spring traplines, and a man who'd been good at being alone, learning, slowly, painfully, gratefully, how to be otherwise. She went down and she testified, in May, in a courtroom packed to the walls, with the spring sun coming hot through the windows and the smell of the valley thick and green after a winter of nothing but snow and wood smoke. She did not shake when she told them about the brake shoe sawn 3/4 through. She gave them the numbers because numbers had never once betrayed her. The 19 soles, the $215, the 40 unpaid, the 3/4 cut in the steel that no honest road could ever explain. She named Royce, and she named the silver, and she named Cyrus Dunmore, and she pressed her thumb against the brass thimble on the rail of the witness box before she said the hardest part, the part about Hetty Pell's eyes and her own 2 clumsy fingers, and the courtroom went so quiet you could hear the spring flies against the glass. The territory heard her, and Cyrus Dunmore did not insure his way out of it. The freight line folded inside the month. The road got an honest survey and an honest warning posted at the waystation, signed by a new agent who had never met Cyrus Dunmore and meant to keep it that way. Marshal Hollis Pratt resigned before they could ask him the questions he did not want asked, and went east and was not missed. And Royce, who'd jumped clear and then talked too much over whiskey and ended by telling the tale that hanged his master, drifted on out of the territory and out of the story, which is the most that men like Royce ever get. Then Maren Adler came home up the pass, the way she said she would. The brass thimble sits on the windowsill of the cabin now, in a square of mountain light, where she put it the day she came back for good. It is the first thing the morning sun finds. Some mornings she picks it up and turns it in her fingers and remembers a freight clerk who tried to name a price for her, and a mountain that tried to take her, and the crescent it cut in her palm the night a stranger came down a slope and told her not to fight him. Then she sets it back on the sill, in the same square of light, and she leaves it that way, because some things you keep exactly where they are, to remember exactly who you were when you stopped being afraid. The gold is still under the floorboard. She has never once needed it. That was tonight's story from Timberline Hearts. She came off the pass the only survivor of a wreck that 19 people did not walk away from, and she found, 4,000 feet up a frozen mountain, the one man on earth who would carry her to safety and never once try to own her. So tell me, before the lamp goes dim and the snow starts again on the high cabin roof, when those 6 riders came up the pass and Eli went down in the snow, Would you have barred the door and prayed, or would you have picked up the Winchester the way Maren did? Tell me in the comments. The cold is cruel, but the bond is unbreakable. So keep the stove hot, stay a while, and I'll see you up the pass next week.